Hello, welcome to Novara Live. I'm Aaron Bastani. Joining me this evening is Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, how are we?
No, I'm not too bad at all. Thanks. It's good to be back with you, Aaron. It's been quite a while since we've shared the stage together, so looking forward to the show as always.
It's been too long. It's been too long. We have a really great range of stories tonight, as ever, but I think they're really going to benefit from Helena's excellent input. Particularly the Labour stories. Coming up tonight, Labour super donor Lord Alli is back in the headlines. Donald Trump has agreed to pause trade tariffs on both Canada and Mexico. And millions of people in the UK are facing a council tax hike this year. Reform UK may only have 5 MPs, but they've been polling very well for months. But when it came to leading the pack, the only firm which had Nigel Farage's party at number 1 was called Find Out Now, which is a relatively small operation compared to the industry leaders. But that has changed, with YouGov broadly accepted as the standard bearer for British pollsters, having Reform UK out in front. This is from the YouGov website, with data collected over the 2nd and 3rd of February. As you can see, Reform are on 25%, Labour on 24%, and the Tories are slightly further back on 21%. By the way, that would be Labour's worst result since 1910. It would be the Tories' worst result ever. Of course, the worst result since the 1830s for them was in July last year. They got 24%. Here, they'd get 21%. Elsewhere, the Greens are on 9% and the Lib Dems are on 14%, both up slightly from the July election of last year. Now, of course, some caveats are in order. First, Reform's lead is within the margin of error, meaning that this data may not accurately reflect reality. Second, we are 4 years out from a general election. Usually at this point, polls mean extraordinarily little. However, it is clear that Reform are on the up, and that perhaps more importantly, the Tories are failing to capitalise on discontent with Labour and Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And if you dig a little deeper, you can begin to see where Reform heartlands could be at the next general election, with the party first in the south of England and the Midlands. Labour, meanwhile, remain in pole position in both the north and in London. The Stats for Lefties over on X extrapolated from those YouGov results to speculate on what it might mean in terms of constituencies. This is fascinating. As you can see here, Reform on 220 seats, Labour on 160, the Tories on 105, the Lib Dems on 79, SNP on 43, the Greens on 6. Pretty remarkable set of results there, because as you can see, you put the Tories and Reform together, you get 325 seats, which is the bare minimum to govern. Is that even a majority? You need 325 plus 1. Of course, we have a Parliament, House of Commons with 650 members. So that's the magic number, 325 plus 1. On that projection, the Tories and Reform are on 325. So there would be no working majority really for either side, left or right. Now let's look at the polling average for all of the major parties over recent months. As you can see, Labour have collapsed. I mean, wow, you go far enough back into the last 2 years and Labour were polling over 50%. I think even 12 months ago, they were on about 44%. Now they're on 26%. This is with YouGov, remember, as well, including YouGov, Ipsos, Survation. This isn't just one poll, which is a Mickey Mouse pollster. This is the poll of polls, and all the people who are contributing to this polling average, they're all members of an organisation which, is effectively certified British pollsters. 26 for Labour, 24 for Reform, 23 for the Tories, 12 for the Lib Dems, 8 for the Greens. Broadly reflects actually that YouGov poll we just saw a moment ago, not in terms of the ranking of the big three, but they're all more or less next to each other within the margin of error. This all confirms also polling published last week, commissioned by the campaign group Hope Not Hate, which was also carried out by Focal Data. They had a sample of 18,000 respondents, so probably quite robust. And their findings suggested that Reform would win 76 seats if a general election was held immediately, including 60 seats presently held by Labour. Not that surprising, given Labour have so many seats right now. They have a massive majority. That same survey also indicated, however, that a 3 percentage point swing towards Reform from both Labour and the Tories could result in the party securing 169 seats. So very small margins here are the difference between Reform getting 70 seats or 170 seats or even 200 plus seats. So we have a poll last week suggesting 160 seats potentially. And to go back to the beginning of this story, YouGov putting reform on 220 seats potentially. Whatever one you want to pick, that's a big improvement on 5 MPs, isn't it? Helena, we have 3 parties all hovering around the mid to low 20s. First past the post is just not set up for this, is it? And we could have a really chaotic election in 4 years' time.
Oh, 100%. This should be the final nail in the coffin for the, quite frankly, ludicrous electoral system that is first past the post. It absolutely has broken down completely with the current polling that we're having, where we now look in terms of vote share like any kind of European parliament. We usually have, there's about 5 or 6 parties broadly of this kind of differences in ideology, and as well in terms of the 5 parties that we have as our main 5 within England specifically, if you discount regional parties. So the idea that we should be doing any of these elections under first past the post anymore is totally for the birds. It's completely for the birds. And unless, outside of the fact that Labour have essentially deliberately, like this kind of Starmer Politburo at the top, deliberately tried to cultivate a voter base that kind of electorally efficiently spreads them throughout what's relevant for first past the post, I think we would have gotten rid of it already. And I think this government actually probably would have gotten rid of it because they're scared about what we're looking at with these current polls, where if they slip a couple of percentage points, like that's even seen hundreds of seats potentially because of the nature of how volatile our electorate looks given the current polling picture. And so they've essentially given themselves a catch-22 where they can't change first past the post because of the electorate that they've cultivated to win under first past the post. And they can't change to PR because it guarantees a Tory reform coalition. So this is really screwed up in terms of where the current government go in terms of electoral reform. It's also really interesting looking at how the votes break down by region. So what we are seeing broadly, I think, as a kind of a consequence of demographic shift and between regional inequality, is a real balkanization of the UK electorate, where you've seen there specifically which parts of the country are being pandered to by certain parties. So coastal regions, Reform UK really support them. Post-industrial Britain, they're really kind of storming through Wales and the northeast, place where we're seeing industrial decline. Funny that should happen in these kind of traditional Labour heartland areas in the northeast and in Wales, when Rachel Reeves has just announced that she wants to do a tech corridor between Oxford and Cambridge. Shows you how far away from regional equality Labour politics is currently prioritised. But Green Party, usually kind of progressive, kind of urban seats. We saw that's where they're second in 40 seats at the general election. They're poised to gain a Bristol seat and to gain Huddersfield of all places. So that's where that potential area of the electorate would be able to move towards. And the Liberal Democrats have kind of colonised the South West at the moment. So given how much FTP, post past the post as an electoral system, breaks down the link between votes and seats, it also has essentially meant that people are specifically voting for certain parties depending on which area of the country they're in. It's a very, very, very awkward way of doing politics, really. Let's be sure. With regards to the fact that Reform UK are now in the lead, this is entirely, essentially, as far as I'm concerned, a consequence of Labour totally being unprepared for governance. Totally unprepared for governance, because the kind of coalition that they've tried to cobble together to get this electorally efficient result in 2024 is based upon people who genuinely just wants to stable governance. They want government to look competent rather than trying to ascribe any sort of ideology to the politics that they want to see. And it's these staggering level of incompetence that, as far as I'm concerned, has turned them away from Labour. Because, as we all know, they could have spent 5 years planning for government, and they didn't. They spent their entire 5 years in opposition, trying to expunge the left from politics, possibly because they didn't think that they were going to be in a position to be in government right now. And then Liz Truss happened, and here we are. And so they only really have themselves to blame for the rise in Reform UK polling, given that they're not finding a way of speaking to the real concerns of the electorate. And to be fair, neither are the Conservative Party. Having lost the election off of a cost of living crisis and gigantic stratospheric failures on the National Health Service, which were the 2 key issues in 2024 at the election, by far more than anything else, more than immigration or anything like that, the 2 issues with the NHS and the cost of living crisis. And what are they doing in opposition? Banging on about the Chagos Islands? Like banging on about taxes on private schools and farmers? It's so monumentally out of touch. And yet Nigel Farage, despite the fact that he cares politically about a lot of the same issues that the Tories do, he at least appeals to the common folk in terms of issues that affect them and like the discontent with the political establishment in this country, which makes the idea of a reform Tory pact, which would break open first past the post and give them a giant majority, far less likely. Like, why would Farage want to tie himself to this absolutely failing conservative brand of politics? And especially when, and this wasn't part of the YouGov poll, this was from the Find Out Now figures, because they show this, 47% of Find Out Now's people that they polled who didn't vote at the last election say that they're going to vote for Reform UK. Again, this was only a couple of polls that we've seen, and this is Find Out Now. They're not the YouGov. They're not like YouGov in terms of their prestige as a pollster. But it shows you, as far as I'm concerned, who Reform UK are appealing to. It's people who are left behind and left behind constituencies, left behind regions of the country, and people who have been so disenfranchised by politics, they didn't even turn up for the last election. So if Reform UK wanted to ally with the Conservative Party, that would damage their personal brand to the kind of part of the electorate that they are speaking to as well. So I don't think the pact is going to happen, especially since Nigel Farage doesn't even like much of the Tories anyway, and completely disregarded the idea of having one before the election. We are looking at a really, really turbulent next few years in politics, given the kind of electoral system we have and the incentives behind each of the political parties who are vying for power at the moment.
Yep, very well put. I have to say, I don't really see the upside for Reform going into government with the Conservatives because they're promising change. And that to me feels like there's two big vulnerabilities for Reform, right? One is they're going to have to back a bunch of candidates, who probably won't be very good. We already had that saga in the last general election where Nigel Farage was saying that candidate selection was done by a private company. That was his excuse. That won't wash in 2029, right? The other vulnerability is, of course, them being viewed as the Tory Party Mark II. Now, I don't see how you rebut that by literally doing a deal with the Conservative Party. The median Reform voter cares about high immigration, crime, high taxation, blah, 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 blah. 14 years of Tory government. They did all that stuff. It would be, from a left perspective or from Labour's perspective, maybe short term it's not good because those guys will be in power. Medium to long term, it I think would be more likely to kill the Reform brand, actually. That's not to say that let's have a Tory Reform coalition, but I don't think it's a sensible thing to do, and that's why I don't think Nigel Farage will do it. I think the goal for Reform is to destroy and replace the Conservative Party. It's a similar story, I should say, as well, because we're remaining on party politics in the UK and Labour in particular. Labour super donor Lord Alli is back in the headlines. Remember him? He's the guy who reputedly gifted Keir Starmer nearly £16,200 of free clothing and various goodies, none of which was initially declared. But don't worry, because it then turned out the figure was £32,000 anyway. Free gear Keir, that's what they were calling him. Alli also gave Starmer's wife, Victoria, £5,000 of free clothing, which at first was also not declared. Oops. Sorry, I forgot this guy gave my wife £5,000 of free clothing. In addition to that, Alli also loaned his swanky Covent Garden apartment to the Starmers, with this apparently having a value of £20,000. Now, you might be thinking, what did they use that for? They have a lovely house in Kentish Town. Well, on the 13th of December 2021, Starmer recorded a Christmas message in that Covent Garden penthouse urging the public to, wait for it, work from home. He did so while giving the impression he was in his own home, with a family photo strategically placed behind him. But of course he wasn't. He was in a multi-million-pound luxury penthouse. And then there was the fact that Alli gave Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson £14,000 to host a 40th birthday party. Here she is last year explaining all of that on Sky News.
Your declaration showed that you received £14,000 from the Labour donor Lord Alli last year. What for exactly?
Yep. So I received that money from Wahid Ali, who's a long-standing Labour peer. It was used to fund two events, all of which was declared properly and thoroughly. That's why that information is in the public domain. The first event was ahead of my birthday, so I was turning 40. I thought it was a good opportunity to get people together in a professional context. So it was journalists, trade unionists, education people, MPs and shadow cabinet. The second event was an event that I held also again for lobby journalists, for people in the education world, as part of a reception. That's it was in a work context,
That's a very nice thing, but if a Tory had done that 2 years ago, I know exactly what you'd be saying to me this morning. They should pay for their own birthday parties.
Look, this was in a work context. I didn't even invite my own...
You just said the same thing.
Yeah,
Come on.
I didn't even... My own family didn't come to that. It was in a work context. I celebrated my actual 40th birthday with my family. We went for a pizza. I celebrated with my kids. This was where I got together colleagues, journalists actually, trade unionists, education people. It was in a very different kind of context. Wahid is a Labour peer. He's been a Labour peer for over 25 years. This is fully transparent. Honestly,
with respect, I think we might be digging a slightly bigger hole here. You've got a lot of people who knew you might be the Education Secretary, and you've got them in a room. You're paying for them to lobby you. I mean, the point about all of this is that to the average viewer, it feels dodgy. It feels like this is now an event for lobbyists.
He's right, by the way. She was paying people to lobby her. Bridget Phillipson was using a donor's money to fund a reception for lobbyists. And worst of all, she's smiling about all of this while she relays the story. They have no idea what they're doing or how corrupt this looks. Now, the undeclared donations by Starmer and Rayner, that was in regards to a New York apartment that was not declared, meant that by October last year, Lord Alli was under investigation by the House of Lords Commissioner for Standards for, quote, alleged non-registration of interests. He was subsequently found guilty of minor breaches, of course, nothing serious happens. Now, what made all of that so bad at the time, you probably remember this, was the impression that these gifts, specifically to Rayner and Starmer, which weren't public, they weren't disclosed, were part of a transaction, a political quid pro quo. Because shortly after Keir Starmer became Prime Minister and entered number 10, Lord Alli, who's also, by the way, Starmer's biggest personal donor, had been given a security pass. That pass gave Lord Alli unrestricted access to Downing Street, where he then hosted a party for other Labour donors. The affair was nicknamed Passes for Glasses because Alli gained a level of access number 10 that exceeded even members of the cabinet, all in exchange for giving some designer specs to Keir Starmer. Seems kind of bad. Seems like the kind of thing that Keir Starmer would really lambast the Tories for. If that was Boris Johnson, we'd probably hear calls for him to resign. But Keir Starmer, of course, it's fine. Now, at the time, those seeking to defend the government said this was a simple misunderstanding. It's not a big deal. Sure, a top donor got some minor stuff in return, but it's not like unelected millionaires were shaping government policy or anything. That would be really bad. Well, it turns out that actually they might have been. And that's because Lord Alli was, according to a forthcoming book by journalists Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire, responsible for spiking potential legislation designed to stop overseas donors interfering in British politics. This is from the Times newspaper, adapted from that forthcoming book. In late 2023, Angela Rayner had planned to announce new measures to ban overseas cash finding its way into British politics. By Starmer's own logic, it was an uncontroversial policy. Labour defined itself in opposition to Tory sleaze. On November 17th, Rayner's advisor, Kate Robson, had emailed the leader's office to inform them of her intentions. Quote, the strategic aim of the policy is to close loopholes in UK donation law, which currently allow dodgy money to enter our politics, primarily through the Tory party, primarily, not just the Tory party, via shell companies or companies with no connection to the UK, Robson wrote. Here was a Rayner policy that none of Starmer's advisors could argue with. Starmer himself was committed to the concept. Rayner's team reported that it had originated in a, quote, high-level meeting in March in which Keir and Angela agreed to a series of recommendations relating to elections. Robson went on, this is of course Angela Rayner's staffer, quote, we're looking to announce this on December 14th in an event with Chatham House. That's a very illustrious think tank event space in Westminster, where Ange will make a speech. We want to speak about how a Labour government will protect democracy across the world, celebrate our strong rules on clean donations, and put forward a clean marker in the sand for the Conservatives to clean up their donations. To flag from the outset, Angela wants to do this event with Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister, and we've already been in touch with his office to secure the date. The leader's office did not object. 6 days later, Robson confirmed that McSweeney, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, was, quote, happy as long as we don't come across as anti-donor. He says the message needs to be that people should be able to contribute to give back. Any voter, anyone with a genuine connection to Britain, has a democratic right to donate and engage in vibrant democracy, be that doctors, nurses, or business people. Well, nurses aren't the people giving multi-million-pound donations to politicians. Anyway, this policy is about preventing people who don't have skin in the game from funneling money into British democracy. Rayner's team knew too that Labour had itself turned down £2.7 million from foreign donors. Gordon Brown duly arranged his flights from Scotland to London. So, as you can see, there's broad consensus around what should be a relatively uncontroversial piece of legislation. You've got the Tories in government. To repeat, this is when Labour are in opposition. Very clever, I think, to lay down that marker, saying we are not like you guys. They're using that line constantly of sleaze, sleaze, sleaze. Here's a very specific policy change, which really underscores how we'll be different. Anyway, the piece continues. But here comes the twist. The piece goes on to reveal this. Then even the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, and a former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, learned they answered to Alli. With a week to go, claimed a party official privy to the fraught discussions, Morgan McSweeney pulled the policy. It turned out Waheed told Morgan to pull it, and so he did. The reason for the intervention by Alli, who himself had interests in the Cayman Islands, was never made clear. Rather clever politics there, played by two journalists. This is absolutely incredible. You have the second most powerful person in the Labour Party. At that time, Angela Rayner wasn't the Deputy Prime Minister as she is today. She was Deputy Party Leader, but also a former Prime Minister. And they want to introduce a really important piece of legislation, which they think creates clear water between Labour and the Tories on corruption, on sleaze, with massive implications. If somebody like Elon Musk wants to donate money into UK politics, and it's spiked by somebody who nobody's ever voted for, very few people have heard of, and is only in the room because he's donated massive amounts of money to the Labour Party. Now, that wasn't the only time Alli appeared to put donors before the party, because the piece continues with this. On other occasions, it seemed as if Alli took a closer interest in what the Labour Party said and did than its own leader. 3 months on from the speech Rayner never gave on March 11th, 2024, The Guardian reported that Frank Hester, the Conservative Party's biggest individual donor, had told colleagues at his healthcare technology company that the sight of Diane Abbott on television made him want to, quote, hate all black women. Hester went on, I think she should be shot. He made Tory donors seem so bigoted that the Labour Party would later quote his comments in emails soliciting donations. Alli, aggrieved by the message he feared the expose might send to Labour's own plutocrats, made his displeasure clear. He feared the story risked a journalistic open season on all donors, regardless of their party allegiance. That morning, staff at HQ, nobody could find a single copy of The Guardian. Some swore they'd seen a colleague hiding the paper away to spare them Alli's wrath in case he saw it. So, picture this. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister today, she's the Deputy Prime Minister, she's the Deputy Party Leader at that time, the second most powerful person in the Labour Party, along with Gordon Brown, a former Prime Minister, says we want a new piece of legislation. We want to keep foreign money out of UK politics. And it's stopped by a party donor who nobody's voted for. And then we have later on Labour doing key messaging around a racist attack by somebody against this country's first ever black MP. And he's also very unhappy. People are allegedly hiding the papers from this guy, Lord Alli. But remember, he doesn't have any power, none at all. Just to finish, this quote attributed to Alli is absolutely extraordinary. There are 4 people in charge of everything, Alli said to one junior official as he passed their desk in Labour HQ. Morgan McSweeney, Pat McFadden, Sue Gray, and me. Others believed he had designed a ministerial role for himself, potentially a plum post in the Department for Culture, Media and Sports. Like I say, DLR Keir. He's like the Docklands light rail. He thinks he's driving the train, but the route is predetermined. And guess what, Keir? It's a driverless train. Helena. This is, of course, very relevant because we had Elon Musk, a month ago now, expressing an interest in donating up to $100 million, around £73 million to Reform UK. Could a decision allegedly made by Lord Alli leave the door open to a game-changing intervention by the world's wealthiest person when it comes to British politics?
Well, undoubtedly, and you only have to look at the absolutely stratospheric level of cognitive dissonance from the liberal Starmerites in their reaction to the Wahid Ali scandals and what's been happening with regards to Reform UK and Elon Musk. When it comes to Elon Musk, it's terrible. He's a plutocrat. He's an oligarch. He's buying our elections. When the Wahid Ali stories were leaked, they were convinced. They were absolutely convinced there was nothing untoward happening. There was no influence on policy. He's just somebody who really wants to see Labour do well. And as Wes Streeting said, it's like donating to charity when business people get involved in our politics. Remember, this is somebody who has made his money off of other people's surplus value, right? When he was at ASOS and places like this, his gains, the money he uses to influence politics, is surplus value extracted from people who work for the companies that he had high level roles in. That is where his money has come from. And he is using it. He's using it directly to influence government policy, right? And this shouldn't be new. Everyone should already know. It's very funny to me that Wahid Ali's objection for this, well, if they go after Tory donors and if they go to foreign donors, they might start coming for all donors. Yes. How about we do start going for all donors? How about we actually have a proper conversation about who controls our democracy? There was a poll done by More in Common showing that overwhelmingly the public in this country believe that our whole democracy is set up to benefit the interests of the rich rather than the common folk of this country. And the two sets of the electorate who both believe this are Reform UK voters and Green Party voters. They both recognise that our democracy is a sham democracy. It's been sold out. And the level to which that the Labour Party as a political entity, which used to be and should have historically been and continued to be a party of the trade unions, a party with which there is a national policy forum where members and ministers and trade union officials come together to be able to decide policy, is having all of that sacrosanct system usurped by the fact that we have a clique at the top of the party who is funded by private capital and people who've been appointed to unelected position in the House of Lords, no less, who can also veto policy due to the fact that they have political and financial influence within the Labour Party. Remember, it's not just Lord Alli that we need to be scrutinising here. It's the £4 million donation from Quadrature Capital. They got their own quid pro quo potentially by one of their climate envoys being appointed to the government's climate change committee. Again, I can't believe that might have nothing to do with the £4 million donation they did just after the limit where it wouldn't have been declared before the election. We know that Keir Starmer is in his position because a leadership campaign and Labour together, the think tank that got him there, was funded with £700,000 of donations that violated electoral law because they weren't declared properly from hedge fund bankers, private equity people, etc., people, again, who do not have the interests of the working class at heart. There's a reason why that Labour backed down on their proposal to tax private equity bosses correctly, because there are people who have interest in private equity and interest in things like private healthcare who are donating to the Labour Party, who have control over the levers of power and who have intimate relations with people who are part of the Starmer Politburo at the top of the party. That, again, is usurping the internal democracy of the Labour Party. The National Policy Forum was essentially a complete sham when they were setting policy because the Politburo, McSweeney, McFadden, people like that, and of course, apparently now Wahid Ali is somebody who's intimately deciding policy as well, who have essentially been able to make sure that people who should be the decision makers are no longer the decision makers in having a collective vision for what the Labour Party should represent. And for Liberals to try and claim that this is something that we shouldn't be taking seriously, in the same way that they are correct about the fact that we should be taking Elon Musk's potential intervention into UK democracy seriously, shows you that their political heuristic is not based around principle or morality or ethics or the sacrosanct nature of democracy. It's blue team bad, red team good. That is all they can apply to whether or not a donation is good or it's just. Because Keir Starmer can do no wrong because he is the red team, and Reform UK and the Conservatives, they're always bad because they're the bad blue team. When if they actually had a moral or ethical standpoint, if they could actually see the damage, the kind of irreparable damage this will do to our political system if we normalise this stuff, normalise it to the public who, as we've seen from, as I mentioned in the current polling, are viscerally opposed to this level of elite influence in our politics, this could lead to a further resurgence of the worst kind of populism that is only born out of cynicism and a level of disempowerment in society, which is what has been created by the fundamental voice of working people, which the Labour Party should be, being usurped by interests that are diametrically in conflict with purported Labour Party values. Which says in their Twitter bio, right? Labour is the party of working people. Well, I don't think that private equity bosses and people who have made their money from other people's surplus value are necessarily the voice of working people. Do you?
Yeah, that's right. It boils down to this. You said about the politics of cynicism. People like Nigel Farage benefit from the politics of cynicism to some extent. People are right to be cynical. It's a very rational position to be cynical. When you have, and this is from that article, and by the way, I've spoken to Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrom. They're at the Sunday Times. I've read their books. I've seen their research. They're pretty fair brokers, right? I wouldn't say that about many journalists at the Sunday Times at the Times. They're not propagandists. Doesn't mean they get everything right, but they're quite fair brokers. And from that excerpt in the paper, but also in their book, the forthcoming book, 4 people in charge of everything. Morgan McSweeney, nobody voted for him. Pat McFadden, okay, he's an MP. Sue, and me. Sue Gray and Lord Alli. So 3 of those 4 people nobody voted for. And they're the people in charge of the party. And then, if you even break it down a bit further, and this is really worrying, right? Morgan McSweeney, his wife, now a Labour MP, elected in July 2024. Sue Gray, her son, a Labour MP, elected in July 2024. The head of Labour's compliance, their legal and compliance team, the person who's meant to oversee the rules and oversee fairness and good standards in the Labour Party, that person, Alexander Barros Curtis, guess what? A Labour MP who I don't think was really subject to a particularly democratic process. You can go on and on and on and on. Sons and wives and the people are meant to be, the NEC members just parachuted into safe seats. This is a level of corruption that, frankly, in terms of internal party politics, simply wasn't there with the Tories. It wasn't that bad. There's a ton of corruption with the Tories with regards to public contracts, procurement, etc. But in terms of internal party operations, nothing as corrupt as that. Nothing. Zero. So if people get cynical, well, like I say, it's entirely reasonable, isn't it? It's entirely reasonable. Sue Gray, 1 minute, she's basically signing the political death warrant for Boris Johnson. Then she goes to work for Keir Starmer. Then her son becomes a Labour MP. I mean, it sounds like a comedy. It sounds like a satire. And I'm on the left. I'm not going to defend that. Why? By the way, there are Labour councillors, Labour members, Labour activists out there, good people. They'll defend that. Don't. Because for regular people, you're going to completely discredit yourselves and your politics. And that's a very bad thing. Long term, it's very, very self-destructive. Don't let this imbecile, who's presently the Prime Minister, allow you to discredit yourself like that. Allow yourself to be viewed as dishonest by other people, when you're not. You're just defending a man who doesn't deserve it. US President Donald Trump has been fanning the flames of trade wars with his allies, his neighbors, and his enemies. Threatened with a 25% tariff on some imports over the weekend, Mexico appeared to concede to some of Trump's demands around border security on Monday, getting a 30-day reprieve while the two sides hash out the details. And now Canada appears to have done the same, with Trump pausing the 25% tariff he'd threatened on some Canadian imports. That pause comes after Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appeared to agree to a set of demands around halting the flow of fentanyl, which is an opioid, across the border into the US. Announcing the details on Monday night, Trudeau said this: "I just had a good call with President Trump. Canada's implementing our $1.3 billion border plan, reinforcing the border with new choppers, technology and personnel, enhanced coordination with our American partners, and increased resources to stop the flow of fentanyl. Nearly 10,000 frontline personnel are and will be working on protecting the border. In addition, Canada is making new commitments to appoint a fentanyl czar." sounds very New Labour. A czar, thousands of people are dying. Guess what? We're going to get a new person in charge who nobody voted for. "We will list cartels as terrorists, ensure 24/7 eyes on the border, launch a Canada-US joint strike force to combat organised crime, fentanyl and money laundering. I've also signed a new intelligence directive on organised crime and fentanyl, and we'll be backing it with $200 million. Proposed tariffs will be paused for at least 30 days while we work together." Now, that sounds like Trump won this round of the trade war. But in fact, Trudeau appears to have offered the exact same package that was broadly agreed with the incoming administration back in December. So Trump had won the election, but wasn't yet in the Oval Office. That border plan already contained that figure of $1.3 billion, the new helicopters and the personnel, as well as steps to tackle the flow of fentanyl. There are also signs that other countries hit by US tariffs have understood that this is less about global trade and more about giving Trump a win for his domestic audience. On Monday night, a 10% tariff on US imports from China came into effect, with Trump saying they were also partly in response to China not doing enough to stop fentanyl from reaching the US. Almost immediately, China hit back, announcing a package of tariffs on around 10% of Chinese imports from the US, as well as an investigation into American firm Google, Alphabet, for allegedly breaking anti-monopoly laws. We could do that. Sounds like a good idea. China also announced export controls on some of its own products, including tungsten and more than 24 other rare metal products and technologies. Now, China's counter tariffs, which will affect around $14 billion of US goods, are only set to come into force next week, which leaves some space and time for negotiations. Trump and Chinese Premier Xi Jinping are reportedly set to speak in the next few days. Helena, there's a lot of competing thinking on this. Some people said, well, this very high level of tariffs that Trump is imposing on Canada is the first step to annexation. Maybe it's just purely for domestic consumption, and actually he wants to rock the boat and he's broadly happy with things that were already agreed back in December. What's your read here? And why is Trump going so hard on tariffs with Canada? After the UK and Israel, this is one of the United States' closest allies. What explains all of this?
I mean, if you wanted to be able to pander to your domestic base by giving strongman vibes, right? In an era of geopolitical uncertainty, the strongman is somebody who comes out on top. We've seen this broadly across world politics since 1945 and previously to that too, where at the time when you feel like that there's something to lose, you go for somebody who looks strong at defending your country, or indeed by using their power to strong arm other countries into giving you what you want. Like, whilst Trump, I think, is an idiot for quite a lot of reasons, there are obviously plenty of people in his inner circle who they fully aware of the facts that a huge level of tariffs being placed on Canadian exports to the United States would drastically harm their voting base, who basically supported Trump for lots of reasons that were to do with the economy and the inflationary pressures that were created, again, largely out of the pandemic from when Trump was previously last time president, but they blamed Biden for it. So they voted against the Democrats on economic concerns and cost of living crisis and inflationary pressures and economic headwinds against the previous administration. So they know that they can't just impose a bunch of further economic headwinds on their own population and come out of that democratically unscathed. But if they do pull this little trick you've seen here that has happened with Trudeau, I could, if somebody told me this was entirely choreographed between the two parties, I would believe them, because this has been domestically popular for both the Trump administration and for Trudeau as well. For Trump, it makes him look like that he's getting this deal that he wouldn't otherwise have got if he wasn't trying to strong arm Canada. And for Justin Trudeau, who knows that these were all things that are all coming down the pipeline anyway, and this is happening with Sheinbaum as well in Mexico too. They've said that they're going to do some policing on the southern border of the United States as well, with the Mexico's northern border. And again, a lot of these plans were already things in place. And it seems that Sheinbaum, Trudeau, and Trump have basically all realized that the American voting electorate aren't going to look deep enough into know what's happening here and just see, well, my strongman won the trade war here by getting concessions, and this shows that he's a competent and strong leader, without looking into the reality of the deal that had been cut here between the multiple different parties. And what's interesting to me is this is actually having an effect on the Canadian election, which is due this year. Like, if people are following Canadian politics pretty closely, the Liberal Party have been absolutely tanking in the polls, 20 points ahead style memes at this point, with regards to the Conservative Party, led by a kind of Trumpian figure, a kind of smarter Trumpian figure in Pierre Poilievre. But of course, it feels like to me, this is Trudeau's Falklands moment. You're drastically dropping in the polls, you're an unliked and unwanted administration, and suddenly something outside of your control happens that gets you to show you standing up for the interests of your country. And you can turn these, quite frankly, disastrous polling numbers around, at least to a certain extent. They're not 20-point deficits anymore on current polling numbers. And there is a one pollster called ECOS that's showing it in minority Liberal government territory, which is unthinkable given how tanking the Liberals were in the polls previously. And there's a potential for Mark Carney to be the new leader now that Trudeau has stepped down, that could potentially save the Liberals, in the extent that, first of all, it shows the Liberals have been strong in reacting to Trump's aggressive policies by essentially giving him what he wanted that he already had access to for his own domestic reasons, whilst looking like that you're saving saving Canadian consumers and exporters, and then replacing the unliked Trudeau with somebody who has links to the party who've done these things, but is also seen as more competent and a new figure in the form of Mark Carney, who's widely perceived to be the favourite for the Liberal leadership. And of course, you're looking at Trump trying to strong arm you. Who's the closest to Trump in Canadian politics? Well, it's Polyev. And you're just like, well, hang on a minute. If this guy is part of this political sphere and people who he is politically close to in other countries are trying to strong arm us by trying to destroy our economy with tariffs and talk about annexation, that's really going to put you off the Canadian Conservatives. So, yeah, it really does feel like a Falklands moment to me that could turn the face of the next Canadian election.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. And it's not just Canada. You have people like Elon Musk going to bat now for the AfD in Germany. With the tariffs that Trump is talking about on German cars and whatnot, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, that is designed to destroy the German automotive industry, designed to destroy it. Why on earth, if you're a German nationalist, be careful, by the way, with that, didn't work out in the 20th century, did it? If you were a German nationalist, why on earth would you back a political party which is supported by a man who wants to impose tariffs and destroy your domestic car manufacturing industry? You wouldn't. So I actually think the endorsements of Trump and people around Trump, like Musk, the endorsements of those guys from the Front National in France, or Rassemblement National as they're now called, or Meloni in Italy, or the AfD in Germany, I actually think that stuff's going to become net negative very quickly. Because, of course, America first means America first. It doesn't mean America and Britain and Germany and Spain and Italy first. It means America first. So bugger the rest of you. While Trump was quick to apply tariffs to imports from Canada, Mexico, and China, when it comes to other trading partners, he's issued threats instead. This was Trump on the US's trade relationship with the European Union.
We have massive deficits with the European Union, massive, like $350 billion, if you can believe it. They don't take our farm product. They don't take our cars. They don't take almost anything, but we take their cars. We have millions of cars coming in, BMW and Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen and just so many different cars, and we don't do anything about that. And we don't charge them tariffs. They make it impossible to sell cars in the European Union. They make it very difficult, agricultural product. They actually don't take it. And they have a lot of excuses. Some of them are the pesticides and the different chemicals used. And Bobby Kennedy actually is looking at that very, very seriously, because maybe it's not necessary to use all of that. We want to be the healthiest country, and we're not. We spend more money on food than anybody else in terms of its creation, but we're not the healthiest country. So maybe there is something to the fact that we shouldn't be using so much chemical, and maybe that'll stop. But Bobby Kennedy is the one, because he is not a believer in all of the things we have done, and neither are the Europeans. So we'll see what happens. But they use it as an excuse not to buy our product. And I asked a couple of the leaders, I don't want to use names, but how many Chevrolets or Fords do you see in the middle of Munich? And the answer is none, because they don't take any cars. They don't take anything. So the European has abused the United States for years, and they can't do that.
Just liquid Trump, right? Why wouldn't the EU import our poisonous food? Maybe they've got a point, by the way, because they agree with RFK. Some of that stuff is probably quite bad news when it comes to human health. Why wouldn't the EU import our American cars? Because they're crap. They're not very good cars. There's a reason why the US imports a ton of European and Japanese cars. They're better cars. Wasn't always the way. They're better cars. They perform better, better fuel economy. They look better. Trump isn't wrong about the US's trade deficit with the EU, although the numbers he quoted there weren't entirely accurate. But there is a deficit. Here's the thing, it's not nearly as dramatic as he's making out. The value of EU exports of goods to the US are around 150 billion euros more than the value of goods imported from the States. So there's a big trade deficit when it comes to goods, but it's not the same for services, where the EU imports over 100 billion euros more than it exports to the US, making the actual deficit, which of course is both goods and services, around 50 billion euros in 2023. In short, the US gets German Volkswagens, the EU gets Netflix. Of course, not all exports to the US are spread equally across the EU, meaning a trade war would hit different European countries unevenly. Worst hit, predictably, would be Germany, already on the brink of recession, with exports to the US valued at nearly 160 billion euros, which is around a third of all European exports to the United States. Now, the EU negotiates trade deals as a bloc. That's the point of the European Commission. And its response to Trump's threat has been bullish. Here's President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen.
We also recognize potential challenges in the relationship with the United States, and we are ready for that. When targeted, unfairly or arbitrarily, the European Union will respond firmly. This weekend, we witnessed how steep tariffs were imposed on Canada and Mexico. Those tariffs raise business costs, they harm workers and consumers, they create unnecessary economic disruption and drive inflation. We do not see much good coming out of this.
Von der Leyen also hinted at the possible unintended consequences of US tariffs on EU goods, posting this online. On China, we will keep de-risking our economies, basically try and move production and supply chains outside of China. But there is room to engage and find agreements that could even expand our trade and investment ties. It can lead us to a fairer and more balanced relationship with this giant, and that can make sense for Europe. With Trump threatening tariffs on our neighbours, it's fair to wonder whether he'll be eyeing up UK trade for similar treatment, especially at a time when Prime Minister Keir Starmer is trying to improve the UK's trade relations with Europe. But if trade deficits are Trump's obsession, then the UK appears safe for now. That's because when it comes to goods, the UK and US export goods to each other of roughly the same value as they import. With services, it's a different story, with the UK enjoying a £70 billion service in the trade with the US. That's things like financial services, legal services, etc. But what Trump cares about is goods, not services, things, and his efforts to reindustrialize parts of the United States. Either way, Prime Minister Keir Starmer appears to be taking no chances, saying this on Monday night. In relation to the relationship between the UK and the US and the EU, I've always been clear that both are important to us. Now, that for me isn't new. I think that's always been the case and will be the case for many, many years to come. That's why in my discussions with President Trump, we've touched on issues of trade and on issues of security, both in relation to the trade we already do between our two countries, but also the security. God, this is like ChatGPT, isn't it? The defense and the intelligence partnership that we've founded over many, many years. He means things like Five Eyes and NATO. Both of these relations are very important to us. We are not choosing between them, but that's historically been a position of the UK for many, many decades now. That's not entirely true because clearly the UK was a member of the European Union. Our economic relations to Europe have been far stronger than they have been to the US. Helena, are you surprised by how deferential Starmer's been to Donald Trump, given he was the king of Remain, he was the arch-lib ahead of 2020?
Well, I'm 0% surprised because there are two acceptable ideological positions that you can take in British politics. And if you don't subscribe to both of these positions, you don't win. You don't get elected in British politics and you will be hounded out of politics for a very, very long time. Those two positions are whatever business wants, business gets. You can't talk about anything anti-business. You can be pro-worker, pro-business, but you can't be explicitly pro-worker because that's a position that opposes business, right? So that's the first position that you have to take if you want to be successful in British politics. The second acceptable opinion that you have to adhere to is that Atlanticism is correct. The special relationship must never be disrupted, and that is a founding principle of British party politics. And this has been part of the uni-party paradigm in politics for a very, very long time. Labour and Conservative, they both continually support this. There was a very short period from 2015 to 2019 where the special relationship was under threat because of Jeremy Corbyn being leader of the Labour Party. But we saw what happened to him and people, Sir Tricom and his little band of brothers to try and usurp the Labour Party leadership. They were working in the background. People from places like the Britain America Project were out there wondering what would happen to the special relationship if somebody who was opposed to American imperial dominance became the Prime Minister of the UK. And we saw what happened to these people. They don't last long. They don't last long in British politics. So I'm not surprised at all that these people are prioritizing the special relationship, given that, on even basic stuff that we should be talking about, like, not selling weapons to someone who might be potentially committing genocide, or by indeed not having the balls to call for a ceasefire early on in Israel and Gaza. We, again, subcontracted our foreign policy out to the United States, so much so that Keir Starmer had to go to Munich to meet up with Antony Blinken to essentially get a blessing to be able to have an official position that supports a ceasefire. We don't have independent foreign policy. And of course, as we've been seeing right now, we don't have an independent trade policy either. Our trade policy gets set by the United States. And if we deviate from that, they show us what for, and they tell us what we will or won't do. And Keir Starmer and all the people in International Trade Department, they have all essentially accepted this and are just letting Trump do whatever the hell he wants, just like they would have let Kamala Harris do whatever she wanted if she won as well, right? That is the position that you have to accept if you're going to be politically successful in UK politics. Now, this is where people would respond and say, but we have a force outside the Uni Party now that's being iconoclastic and insurgent politically, and that is Reform UK. And unfortunately, they are even more committed to Atlanticism and the special relationship even further than either of the other two parties are with regards to this particular issue. It's the fundamental kind of hypocrisy and contradiction in this kind of imperial nostalgia that undermines that underpins a lot of pro-Brexiteer arguments, which is that, well, previously we were sold out to the EU, we were part of the EU superstate, whereas we should be an independent, strong Britain branching out for ourselves. What has actually been the result of that? Becoming a vassal client state of the United States. And Richard Tice is essentially entirely sold into this. I was watching an interview with him on Times Radio, where he was essentially saying, it's ridiculous that Keir Starmer could even consider trying to prioritize the EU over the United States. And we should do whatever Trump wants because this is what's best for British people. Okay, so what you're admitting is that we don't have any position to actually be our own independent country. No sovereignty at all, just being a vassal state of the American empire, because we're not a strong country. We are a small country that's not that powerful anymore in the way that these nostalgists think that we should be on the world stage. And decoupling ourselves from one of the big three trade blocs, which at the moment is the United States, which is the EU, and which is BRICS, decoupling ourselves from one of the strongest ones of these that give us international recognition and makes us a rule taker rather than a rule maker, rather than a rule taker that we are from the United States when they set our policies for us, shows you just how completely facile these arguments are. Like, you can make an argument for like BRICS or whatever if you want to, but just on that Brexiteer argument of British sovereignty, newsflash, we have no sovereignty. We don't even have control over our own nuclear weapons, right? This is all at the behest of the United States empire too, to the point at which we are reneging on our adherence to an ICJ ruling over the Chagos Islands because Trump said so. Like, again, this isn't independent. This isn't being done with British people's interests at heart. It's being done to appease Atlanticists and to appease people who favour the special relationship over the interests of regular people in this country. And if you want to be able to extricate yourselves from this, you can't support the Uniparty anymore. And as far as I can see, with regards to being pro-EU, the Lib Dems are kind of taking that line, with an actual desire to see, civic nationalist politics that represents the interests of British people actually first. I mean, it's the SNP and the Green Party for different reasons, but they actually oppose this kind of special relationship politics that underpins the Uniparty in this country.
Yeah, I'm very happy you talked about the Uniparty consensus on this stuff. Isn't it incredible? For my entire life, we heard from the right, we need to leave the European Union. It's a European federal superstate they're trying to build over there, don't you know? And now, less than a year into a Labour government, we've left the European federal superstate, apparently, and now they want to become the 51st state of the United States, another federal superstate. And by the way, that's not a federal superstate in the making. It's been a federal superstate for the best part of a quarter of a millennium. I don't think that's what taking back control was meant to mean. And on Trident, very key to identify this, Helena, the Trident missiles have to be serviced in the US. We cannot service them here in the UK. So this idea that it's an independent nuclear deterrent, simply not true. You don't even need to talk about the deterrent bit. It's not independent. Because unless it's serviced by the US, Trident does not work. That's quite a big stick for somebody like Donald Trump, isn't it? Now, I've been saying that for years. And I was mocked by many, many people, serious, intelligent people in British politics and the media. And now you've got American nationalists on X saying, lol, the Brits, they'll do what we tell them because they don't even have a nuclear capability. If we don't want them to have one, they don't have one, lol. That's the reality of the situation. And the entire British public has been systematically lied to by the media and our political class to not disclose that information. They've been lied to. We will have to pay $100 billion plus to a new Trident. That is effectively a subsidy for American strategic defense. We are subsidizing a global system, which effectively is, like I say, an extension of US interests and US power. The British taxpayer is paying for that. But nobody in the media or political class will say that. Because, if you want to progress, the BBC, Sky News, etc., don't talk down the special relationship, even though that's exactly what we need to do if we care about people in this country. If you care about maximizing the interests of working people in this country, you absolutely need to call this stuff out. Nobody in the uni party is willing to do it. Council tax is set to rise across England from April, as it does every year. But this year, residents in some parts of the country are going to be in for a shock. Yes, even more than usual. That's after the Labour government agreed that some councils can raise their tax by significantly more than 5%, meaning a large hike for millions of people. Now, usually, local authorities can only raise council tax by 4.99% each year. If they need to raise it by more than that, they can ask the government for permission, but it's only meant to happen in really extraordinary circumstances. But this year, the government has allowed 6 areas to boost their income at rates well over that cap. Sky's Kay Burley asked Social Care Minister Karen Smith why.
Windsor, Maidenhead, Birmingham, Bradford, Newham, Somerset, Trafford, the list goes on. Some of them want to increase it by up to 9%. Is that fair for people who live in those boroughs?
Well, I think it's, the state of councils, as much of the public sector that we inherited in July, is dire. They are really struggling. They're struggling across the entire country. So my understanding is that in looking at that, some places are struggling more than others. I mean, there's a mix there of Conservative and Labour councils, so
there is,
and rural,
but you're the government,
and
you can decide whether or not they can increase it by that amount.
So my understanding is that many more councils have come forward to ask for that increase, and that the department has said no to that. That they're scrutinising that very closely because we don't want to see taxes increase in people in those areas. But those areas are particularly desperate and need that in order to keep basic services running. It's a really, really dire state that local government has been left in.
And there's no doubt that 14 years of austerity left councils across England in dire straits. This graph shows the change in English councils' spending power between 2010 and 2024, 14 years of Tory government. On the far left are those councils that were dealt the biggest cuts, with a handful suffering around a 50% loss in spending power. But at the median, cuts amounted to around 28%, with only 6 councils seeing their budgets increase. Now, as austerity hit, many councils turned to the private sector to provide services on the promise of greater efficiency. And that appears to have resulted in some pretty shocking stories of council waste. Among the local authorities being given permission to raise council tax above 5% is the leafy area of Windsor and Maidenhead. They asked for a whopping 25% increase, but will instead be able to raise council tax by 9%. But a recent article in the Mail Online showed how costs relating to social care have spiralled out of control in the area. Sitting through a meeting of the council's cabinet on Wednesday night certainly provided a sobering insight into the parallel universe of local government finance. At one point, it emerged that local taxpayers are now paying residential care homes more than £5,000 a week for every child they look after. That's more than £250,000 a year, or 4 times the cost of sending them to the borough's poshest school, Eton, which is of course a boarding school. That is extraordinary. £250,000 a year. This is with the private sector, which apparently is, we can maximise savings and it's so efficient. That piece goes on to say this. What's more, the number of children in such institutions has more than doubled in the past year, from 16 to 34. Another 140 are in foster care at between £25,000 and £50,000 a year per child. No wonder social care now swallows 3/4 of Windsor and Maidenhead's budget, a figure mirrored in authorities across the country. How much of this cash is well spent? It's impossible to say. Now, what the Mail article doesn't point out going on there is that much of the money, which is in regards to children's care services, is going to private providers. According to a 2023 report, the biggest independent children's care providers in England made over £300 million in profits in 1 year. That's £300 million slipping out of the social care system and into the hands of private business. It's effectively £300 billion going from council taxpayers who are seeing their council tax go up every year to private interests. And as the Mail article says, that spend is being replicated across the country. In some places, it's even worse. This is from the Harrogate Informer reporting on Leeds Council's budget meeting in December last year. The latest figures for Leeds show the scale and the impact of the national care system of external residential provision for children, which is being felt by councils across the country. In Leeds, in the last 4 years, the costs associated with looking after children in external residential care has risen by 75%, from 68 million to 119 million pounds this year. The average cost of an external residential placement has gone up by 45% since 2021-22 to currently £6,300 per week, or £340,000 per year per child being cared for. A third of £1,000,000 a year, which is almost 50% up on 3 years ago. Costs for those children with especially complex needs, however, can be up to £1 million per year per child. Now, we've learned from a well-placed source that Leeds has begun exploring a return to council-owned residential homes. With just 4 children now in smaller in-house care units, the council is reportedly looking to save £1 million a month. And in what might be the beginning of a trend, Windsor and Maidenhead have also recently proposed the building of a council-owned residential home in an effort to save on costs associated with bloated private sector provision. Helena, look, really important to talk about cuts to local government, really important to talk about austerity. Absolutely true, as we said at the top of the story, that there have been massive, massive reductions in what central government sends to councils, some as much as 50% fall, average is 28%. All true, really bad. If it was up to me, if I was the Prime Minister, probably the first thing I'd reverse would be those cuts to local government from Westminster. But there's also a tremendous amount of waste going on, isn't there?
I mean, the waste is due to privatization, right? It's all part and parcel of the same ideology that caused austerity, that caused these council cuts, that caused essentially what David Cameron tried to do in 2010 to 2016 was this change to they marketed it as this idea that we're going to give councils the power to do their own investments. What did it lead to? Like whatever the mess we saw, like Thurrock Council, where they squandered huge amounts of their community's resources, and slightly sadder stories like in Nottingham Council, they tried to set up their own energy supplier for local constituents, which couldn't compete because our energy supplier sector is ridiculous, and that lost them a load of money as well because they were incentivized due to cuts to try and find bespoke ways of making money on the grounds that would make these people far more, they would make them entrepreneurs for their own local communities. And all it did was just further compound the problems that we've seen from over privatization, these crazy, crazy costs, and not just costs in financial terms either. These private care homes it's a scandal. It's a giant scandal that no one seems to want to cover. That just seems to be buried inside specific interest pieces in newspapers that people don't really pay attention to. The scandal of private care is absolutely insane. It's totally insane the things they're doing to our children and our old people because they are putting the interests of private equity profits over the lives of the people in this country. You cannot take something as incredibly important as the care of the most vulnerable people in society and allow private capitalists, private equity bosses to use this as a cash cow, not just to milk the state, but to milk the lives of the people that we are entrusting in our care. And I cannot put into words the absolute level of vandalism, the vandalism that George Osborne has done to this country, to the point at which it's probably irreparable. It's probably irreparable, the damage that George Osborne has done for all of these different ideologies that we've spoken about today. So with regards to things like social care, this is a massive compulsory spend that these councils all have after they've had their budget slashed, especially in places, that are kind of left behind areas. Great Yarmouth and Pendle, the two councils that have seen the biggest number of cuts. Great Yarmouth elected fucking Rupert Lowe from Reform UK. I wonder why, given the state of their local economy being shredded by George Osborne's reckless ideological nonsense that he's done to destroy the country from the inside. The housing crisis to play with this as well. The lack of provision for new council housing, or the lack of provision to try and deregulate planning to try and expand the number of houses that we have, because George Osborne was centrally focused on maintaining high house prices so that his affluent base could continue to vote him into election every single time. Damning indictment on the failure of democracy in this country. This was allowed to happen for so long that it is bankrupting councils because they're having to pay stratospheric amounts for temporary accommodation for the scores of homeless people that have been created by the hubris of George Osborne and David Cameron from 2010 until 2016. And the biggest scandal of all of this is that to finance these problems, to finance this gigantic lag of this 40% cuts in some places on average into funding for local government from central government, a lot of these councils have had to sell off assets to the tune of £15 billion in total across the entire inventory for the councils in the United Kingdom since 2010. £15 billion, all sold off to private equity bosses and companies that from South Korea and from Germany and all of those places, KKR, etc. And that's, if you're watching at home, that's stuff you owned. You owned that stuff, viewers. And they have been sold off due to George Osborne's ideologically motivated austerity to shrink the state for his mates in the private equity sector who donate to the Conservative Party, specifically to feast upon the carrion of the British state that was created through this this vandalism, this total vandalism, this economic lunacy of the austerity budgets from 2010 to 2016. It, quite frankly, is exactly the same as what happened to our water industry under Thatcher, where she was desperate to sell it off to her mates. So she deliberately set it up so they couldn't access private capital to finance upgrades for water quality to adhere to European Union laws on increased water quality. And they all folded. They all folded overnight due to reforms that were made specifically to try and hamstring these parts of the country to make them juicy for a sell-off. They done it with Royal Mail in the 2010s with the help of their Liberal Democrat accomplices, and they did it to councils as well. So the things that you hold dear to you, libraries, swimming pools, youth centres, things that should be part of our local community are now owned by billionaire capitalists and private equity monsters across the other side of the world, again, carving up the British state for private interests and selling it off for pennies. And what have we got to show for it? Old people and children being mistreated in care homes, our councils going bankrupt, and increasing the cost of taxation on local residents to the tune of 9% in some cases. And I'm sorry to say, George Osborne is directly at fault. I can't really blame the current Windsor and Maidenhead Council, because this has only recently become a Liberal Democrat administration in 2023. And again, who is to blame? Of course, it was the Conservatives who were in control before. They were the ones who had these ridiculous privatisation contracts set up. These were the ones who had mismanaged council finances up until now. You cannot trust these people to engage in the role of governance, because the fundamental kind of conservative ideology with their role to governance is that you govern to be able to win. You don't govern to be able to engage in social utility or for the good of your constituents. It's the most cynical kind of politics, and quite frankly, the quicker this party, the Conservative Party, dies, if it has to get replaced by Reform UK, so be it. The quicker that party is expunged from existence 200 years later after its founding, that cannot come soon enough.
Couldn't agree more. People said, oh, reform, we have to stop reform. The damage that the Tories did under an allegedly centrist coalition after 2010, it's never going to be matched. It is never going to be matched. And like Helena says, I don't think we can recover, actually. Maybe we can. It's going to take, honestly, 50, 100 years. I don't think people realise the extent to which Cameron locked in low productivity, low growth, declining crappy public services, declining crappy high streets. And you talked about the things that people care about, Helena, also just things like street cleanliness. People walk down a high street and go, wow, it looks like real shit around here. Well, it's because it's been outsourced to a company, Sodexo, Serco, whoever, Capita. They do a crap job. They pay their workers crap money. And people think, well, it looks like shit around here. I know. It's because of immigrants. No, it's because of an economic political model which is designed to fail and channel your money, which is, increasingly seeing really high council tax increases. Your money is directed to these companies doing a shit job. And where you live looks awful, right? We could talk about this all day, but what I would say is just simply this. When it comes to things like elderly care, childcare, street cleanliness, how is this not in public ownership? How is this not in public ownership? I think somewhere like Hampshire County Council, 84% of their budget now is on social care. Adult social care because of ageing population, also young people too. We can't afford for this stuff to stay in the private sector. It's not, we can't afford to do this stuff in the public sector with public ownership. We literally can't afford as a society to do this stuff with the profit motive. We literally can't afford it. Otherwise, you're going to have to see council tax increase by double digits every year for the rest of your life. We literally can't afford it. Rather than having hundreds of kids being ferried around in taxis, right, which is very common, by the way, with local authorities, why not get a minibus and have it owned by the local authority? Just an idea. This is not radical. It's not even particularly left-wing. It's common sense. It's common sense, which is in desperately short supply in this country. Why? because our media is institutionally stupid. So if you want to make it a little bit more smart, how about you go to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. Help us build the new media for different politics. You've heard a lot of common sense tonight, almost all of it from Helena, and help us create even more of it, find an even bigger audience. Like I say, it's novaramedia.com/support. Link is in the description below. We could not exist without our supporters, right? We couldn't exist without you. Helena, thanks for joining me this evening.
I've had an absolutely wonderful time this evening, and there were some hard truths that a lot of people in the British press should really be taking heed of, but we both spoke about this evening.
We did. They all live in like 2 square miles in London. There's a reason why they don't care about the rest of the country. And for the rest of you, thanks for joining us tonight. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.